Hello, and welcome along to this podcast on the Edie Extra channel. You're listening to the voice of Sarah George, Edie's content editor, and this is Susty Talks, our series of short but sweet one-on-one interviews with sustainability leaders from across the world, designed to keep us all a bit more informed and connected, even if we are pressed for time. I'm delighted to be speaking today to the Global Sustainability Lead at Mars Pet Nutrition, Heidi Koester Oliveira. Heidi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. It's so much fun to be here.
Yeah, it's great to catch up with you too. For the benefit of everyone at home, it'd be great to hear a little bit about your role and your key focus areas at the moment.
Sure. So I lead sustainability for Mars Pet Nutrition together with a group of incredible technical experts, functional leaders who are all focused on advancing our circular packaging agenda, our climate and sustainable sourcing work, and our thriving people focus, or the social sustainability components of our broader sustainability plan. We are part of Mars Pet Care, the largest pet care company in the world. You or your listeners may not be familiar, but we actually have the privilege of touching the lives of more than 500 million pets every year across our food nutrition business, veterinary and health services, and our science and diagnostic business. So with that comes incredible scale and reach, and really a huge opportunity and responsibility to embed sustainability throughout these core business practices.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about sort of the upstream and what's going on there. So towards the end of 2024, we saw big announcements from Mars as a whole about regenerative agriculture and restating its target and noting some important partnerships. So what does regenerative agriculture look like in the pet care supply chain, and why is that so important?
Sure. So I'll start with why it matters. Regen ag can feel like a bit of a buzzword to some parts of the business community, but as you and many of your listeners know, it's really about going back. It's not a buzzword at all in the agricultural supply chains themselves. It's science-based, in many ways going back to farming as nature itself intended it, right? Why is it so important at this moment, though, that we return to and deepen those regenerative practices across the agricultural supply chains globally? One, we know that food production contributes almost a third of global carbon emissions. So the reduction and removal potential there is massive. Second, we know that conventional agriculture really isn't sustainable. It's contributing to soil degradation. It's contributing to overall pollution, complications with water use, et cetera. And so the way that farming is happening now at an industrial scale isn't sustainable moving forward. That's where climate smart agriculture and regenerative practices really come into play on two fronts: mitigating the immediate extreme weather climate shocks that we're seeing, but equally importantly, rebuilding more resilient farming systems for the future.
From sitting here in the UK, we're seeing a lot of push for regenerative to help safeguard farms against the sort of very wet weather that we had last year. So the resiliency benefits are often talked about, but I think some businesses are still grappling with how to fit this into their net zero plans and what the potential mitigation for climate benefits are. So how is Mars factoring regenerative agriculture into its net zero roadmap?
Yes, this is a great question, and it's really a key component of our overall Mars Incorporated Net Zero roadmap. So we'll drop a link in the show notes to the roadmap itself, but this is something we launched about 2 years ago. And within it, you'll see our analysis of our footprint, which captures about 60% of our Mars Incorporated global emissions are tied back to the agricultural part of our overall value chain. So that's part of why regenerative agriculture is such a key component. Addressing that agricultural element of our emissions is critical. And we're doing that through a couple of ways. One is through formulation. So I think it's really interesting to think about in the pet care side of our business, we've got an entire team of climate formulators looking at how can we keep the same nutrient profile of our pet food recipes, but reduce the carbon emission overall. That's by changing ingredients, or it's by using ingredients that are more optimized in how they're grown. Another way we're looking at this within the Net Zero roadmap is around exploring alternative materials altogether. Are there new innovative ingredients that are low carbon, ultra no carbon, even no carbon? And the third is regenerative agriculture itself. And when we think about that in the context of our net zero roadmap, the only other framing piece I would tee up before we get into how we're really bringing this to life would be the early results we're seeing. So last year we reported at a Mars Inc. level some tremendous progress in our journey. So total cumulative reductions of 16% at an absolute level compared to our 2015 emission baseline, while we grew the business by 60%. So this is incredibly encouraging. It also means there's a lot more to do as we strive toward our 2030 target, which is part of this overall roadmap of cutting our emissions in half. Again, that's absolute emissions going back to a 2015 baseline. So you can see the measures we've put in place through the net zero roadmap are obviously based in science and quite ambitious. The early progress we have is encouraging, but as I mentioned, there's much more to do, and stepping up and scaling our work in regenerative agriculture is a key piece of this plan. Good news is that from a pet care standpoint, we've got about 30 initiatives that are already underway. So we are beginning to move from pilots to scale. We're looking at initiatives across about 13 countries, 9 key crops. And when you think about our recipes and our nutrition portfolio, we're beginning to address regenerative agriculture in the grain supply chain primarily. So think about things like corn, wheat, rice, soy. We're also starting to look at the livestock side of things, so beef or poultry supply chains. How can we look at regenerative practices there? But we've really got an incredible laboratory underway with these 30 initiatives and growing, all laddering up to a Mars Inc. ambition to reach 1 million acres that are using regenerative practices by 2030.
Great, and that's what I wanted to get into. I think we've talked about the big picture, and I'd love to cover some of the practicalities of doing the regenerative agriculture on the ground, bringing this to life, scaling up and meeting those targets. And I guess a good starting point would be to look at measurement and management, because there doesn't seem to be like a global single definition of regenerative agriculture. And as you've mentioned, what works for one crop might not work for another, completely different for poultry, completely different for beef. So how is Mars defining and categorizing regenerative so that you can meaningfully measure your progress?
Across all of our initiatives, we are keeping in mind a couple of core principles. So one is that context-specific frame that you mentioned. There's no one recipe, there's no one size fits all. What works for wheat in Poland will be very different from what works for corn in Mexico. So what we've done in the absence of a unified, globally accepted, rigorous definition of regenerative agriculture is we've taken general principles from some of the leading thinkers and industry-wide groups that are defining this in a quite practical way. So we've pulled core principles largely from the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, or SAI's working definition, and created just a short guidebook that we're using in each initiative where we're bringing regenerative agriculture to life. We're providing this bit of a cheat sheet that just underscores the principles, the framework that we're operating in, and then really counting on farmers themselves and our technical expert partners to bring the context-specific interventions and innovations that work within this framework. And the core principles we're looking at won't be surprising. They're around keeping the soil covered, rotating crops, reducing physical disturbances from tillage, reducing chemical use, and of course, integrating animals into the system. And overall, across Mars, we're also exploring other interventions in this space, things like climate smart agriculture as well. So using the regenerative ag principles and also opening pathways for other frameworks where they make sense.
I'm fascinated about essentially the actions behind each of these initiatives. So what are the steps to starting and continuing these 30 projects that you mentioned? Where do you begin?
Wow. I think 3 areas that we're just reflecting on as we look at the 30 that are in progress and more to come across Mars Pet Care. 3 things come to mind. One is the importance of really getting incentives right. So one of our initiatives with our Royal Canin brand and an organization called Soil Capital is doing fantastic work of incentivizing farmers and grain supply chains, largely in Europe, but also looking at other geographies, to ensure payment for outcomes. So the work with Royal Canin focused in our grain supply chains and soil capital is trying to get that incentive, encouraging farmers to take a risk, to take a change, which is, change for anyone is difficult and unknown, but building in an incentive structure that shows financial benefit for outcomes and for activities that lead to those outcomes. So that's one example. Another area in the space of incentives is getting the incentive for farmers to take that risk and join us on a longer term transition, getting that right from a timing perspective. So in our experience, that looks like getting longer term contracts in place where we are entering into, whether it's purchase agreements over a 5-year or longer frame of time, that is making a difference in willingness and early adopters to come on a journey that can be unknown, new, or pioneering in a specific geography or supply shed. So getting those incentives right, whether it is from compensating for outcomes and ensuring that their switch to regenerative practices is more profitable than conventional, and ensuring the incentives on the front end around the long-term duration of this kind of initiative makes sense. So an example there is also around our work with ADM in North America and in Europe, putting in place and joining parts of existing initiatives that, again, look at that 5-year or beyond horizon. So it's clear that we as Mars are in this collaboration for the longer term. The second piece I think that's needed to really deliver these changes at scale is around innovation. So that really harnesses on this understanding that farmers themselves are the ones who are going to deliver innovation. It's going to come by, through, and with farmers. It's not going to come from what you've heard of referred to as pencil farming or PowerPoint farming or Excel farming, but really entering into these collaborations with the spirit of ensuring that farmers have the space to innovate. And what that can look like, again, very different in different contexts. So some of our initiatives in Latin America or in Asia, whether we're working with corn farmers in Thailand or we're looking at soy farmers in Brazil or corn in Mexico, really understanding the importance of technical access, technical experts that are familiar with the local context and that are unleashing local innovations with farmers as partners, moving away from pure academic exercises or things that are too far removed, great ideas on PowerPoint but not in the soil. And the third area that's needed to really deliver transformation in agricultural supply chains at scale is around inspiration. So we've been investing in ways to connect customers, consumers, pet parents themselves into the journey of soil health to really understand that the work that farmers are doing, how healthy soil contributes to healthy ingredients in the food we feed our pets. Pet parents care about this topic. In fact, we did the largest survey of pet parents in the world last year. And one of the data points from that study, we can also drop a link to this in the show notes as well. But one of the data points was that more than half of the pet parents we surveyed shared they place a priority on sustainability attributes when they think about what to feed their pets. So it's becoming more and more important. We're starting to see more and more opportunities to link our work on regenerative agriculture and soil health with the healthy crops, the healthy nutrients, and what's really going into our products. So we can maybe drop in the show notes a link to one of the short films our Nutro brand has collaborated to produce that allows farmers to tell their stories on a broader platform of what's worked, what's been challenging, how did they begin to take on what was new and different in their part of the world or in the crops that they work on, and what are the benefits they're seeing, both from maintaining yields, increasing yields, reducing the cost of inputs, and beyond the GHG reduction, we're able to unlock this inspiration of farmers sharing with others what the co-benefits they're seeing from biodiversity, from their own profitability and income perspective as well. So there's those areas around incentives, innovation that's farmer driven, and creating the space for inspiration that allows farmers to share experience, but also connect to our consumers and pet parents. I think those are three areas that are really helping us move beyond initial pilots to more work at scale that's bringing in more collaboration and more key partners.
Got it. Sounds like a lot of exciting work underway there. And on that engagement piece, I wanted to ask about, you've talked a little bit there about farmer to customer engagement, but what about how they're engaging with your company, or maybe even how you facilitate them engaging with each other to support this transition?
Yeah, the way that we're structured, I think it's useful to understand that we don't, from a matter of the way our business operates across Mars Incorporated, particularly in Mars Pet Care, we often don't have direct relationships with farmers. We aren't buying directly from farmers. We don't own farms. So in order to really engage authentically for the long term in this transition, to bring more and more farmers in our supply chain into regenerative agricultural practices, it's key that we're going in with the right supply chain partners. So often our suppliers are working with networks of farmers, cooperatives of farmers, those at a large scale, often in the US and Europe, and those in smaller scales, for example, in Asia and Thailand. But our entry point to engage as Mars in these farming communities is most often through supply chain partners, so suppliers that are already there and have a presence locally. And I think that's really important, that we're not jumping over points in the supply chain, but we are both connecting with suppliers who are closest to growers, and technical implementing partners. So each of the 30 initiatives I mentioned, they're each bringing in a technical expert advisor, often who come from farming backgrounds themselves, who can speak to what worked for them and networks of farmers they have access to that an individual grower in a specific initiative may not. So I think the way that we're helping connect to farmers is A, going directly in through our supply chain partners, and B, ensuring the technical experts that we bring in are talking amongst themselves, are bringing farmers together, everything from initial trainings, doing soil health demos where, again, you've got agronomists, in many cases, in most cases, farmers themselves, bringing real case studies, real examples of what has worked, what hasn't worked in their supply chains and in the farming groups they've advised to the table from the very beginning. So that piece of context-specific technical assistance from credible partners who literally speak the same language has been really essential.
That makes complete sense. I think we all want to learn from, the experts in our field and from our peers, regardless of what career we're working. So that makes complete sense. And Heidi, you've given us so many great takeaways already in this episode. But as we come to the end of the episode, I just wanted to give you the last word on what advice you'd give to other businesses looking to scale regenerative agriculture in their value chain. Anything further to the array of top tips we've already covered?
I would say a couple of things, Sarah. One, it's become a bit of a mantra within Mars, and I think for good reason, is to really be intentional about getting your boots dirty. I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but particularly for those who aren't involved in day-to-day work with suppliers, with growers in supply chains, creating the space and opportunity for leaders at every level of your company to get on the ground, to literally get boots dirty and see these initiatives in practice. In my experience, it will transform the engagement, the enthusiasm, the understanding of why this work matters. There's nothing like seeing it with your own eyes. And whether that looks like literally getting out on a farm, ideal, or in our post-COVID world, team calls with suppliers and growers in a network that are really thoughtfully put together can have a big impact. It's just that spirit of moving away from PowerPoint farming and pencil farming to put an emphasis on getting boots on the ground, particularly for functions that aren't as engaged. Think about your finance organization or elements of a commercial team that's not connected to specific agricultural supply chains. It makes a tremendous difference. Second tip I would offer would be focusing on these barriers to adoption. There are reasons why regenerative agriculture isn't scaling at the pace we would all hope it is. Some of the latest modeling shows, in fact, we need to triple the rate of global cropland that's covered by regenerative agricultural practices by 2030 if we are to limit the impact of the climate shocks we're already seeing. There's a reason that's not happening. So I think a focus on understanding the barriers and addressing them, really quite a forensic and context locally specific focus, is important as you're getting off the ground or just even continuing for the long term. So that idea of getting our boots dirty and leaning in to understand and address barriers to adoption are critical ones. And lastly, I would say getting bolder and bigger in our collaboration. Many companies have started this journey in a pilot phase, ourselves included. We're now seeing a much more coordinated move, a move from tinkering on the edges of supply chains or supplier practices to real transformation. And what that looks like at the next level is extreme collaboration, not siloed initiatives. So starting to work even more deeply across manufacturers, retail partners, and bringing in the consumer pet parent connection. That's really the next level of this work, and that's where we're excited to go next and go with others who are ready to pick up this phase of the journey together.
Great. Well, Heidi, I obviously wish you and your team all the very best of luck with that work over the coming months. But that's all the time we have for this episode of Susty Talk. So thank you once again for all your insights and for your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Take care.